Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Sherwood. I'm the Curator of Cultural Engagement, and my role is to look after our Maar Gallery, which is to my left there. So hopefully you guys might have seen Sea Country, which is just recently opened, and I've had lots of help from these guys behind me, so thank you so much to in particular John Sherwood, who has helped loan me with samples, and now we're about to learn about why Moyle is such a special place. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the land of the traditional owners that we're upon today, and that's the Deakin people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So now I'll quite happily pass you over to the stars of the show, and we've got John Clarke, who's Cultural Landscapes Officer of the Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation, and then we've got the Honourable Dr. John Sherwood. Oh, hang on, sorry, you've got your...
So, my name's John. I'm the Horticultural General Manager of Eastern Maar Corporation. I'm also a Karangaroo man, so through my mother's country from Allisford down towards Peterborough. That's our natural lineal line. I'm going to take the opportunity to just acknowledge there's lots of people in the room today, there's lots of elders, and I just want to acknowledge Uncle Bell at the back there, who's not here, relaxing at that. And so, yeah, I think today, John and I actually haven't had an opportunity to catch up and discuss how we're going to construct this conversation. But hopefully it is a conversation, because I often find myself, when I do talks like this, I learn a lot from the experience as well. So I do encourage, I think at the end of the session there will be opportunity for questions. And so I certainly encourage anyone to ask a question, because there's no silly questions, and so yeah, certainly encourage the dialogue. I think today it's probably an example of a greater conversation that's happening across the country and certainly across the world with other Indigenous communities.
Sorry.
And so and that conversation really is around the alignment of Indigenous knowledge and what we know as Western science and Western knowledge. And Indigenous, that relationship is starting to bridge more and more. And on this particular topic of Moyle, there is, today's presentation really is going to be about local and about Moyle, but this is really at the forefront of all of those conversations that are happening right across the country. And I think we're going to have a good conversation today, because you will see how the Western, they get the tape measure out and measure everything, and there's a whole complete different lens on how that relationship is with Moyle and country, and contrasts with how we have that relationship as well. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation about that today, and so hopefully that will show. And so thank you all for coming in, and we'll speak to you soon.
So, is everything okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so welcome, and thanks for that introduction, John. Right at the start, I'd like to say that this Moyle project has, in its last 10 years, featured strongly cooperation with traditional owners, and we've worked very, very closely with them through the whole phase of the research and the management of the site, and it's been a very productive partnership. The traditional owners are very supportive of the research, and so we're really pleased to be able to give a joint presentation today. I'd also like to acknowledge that this work is not my work, it's the work of the team, and I'm very fortunate that 3 of my co-researchers are here today. I'll embarrass them publicly by getting them to put their hand up to Professor Randy Bennett, who's Professor of Archaeology at Monash University, and Dr. Stephen Herrick from Federation University. Professor Jim Bowler is an apology today, but that team of 4 people, it's just a multidisciplinary team. We have archaeologists, earth scientists, and myself, the chemist, who have collaborated to try to solve what is a significant puzzle, we believe, for Australian history. So, perhaps the next slide. So this is the area that I want to talk about. It's familiar to all of you, I know, the mouth of the Hopkins River, and superimposed on it, courtesy of Wanneroo City Council, are contour areas that show a very high elevation dune, leading inland of the coast there, up to about 30 metres high. It's an old sand dune. In fact, it's not one sand dune, it's multiple sand dunes, one on top of the other, preserving its morphology through hundreds of thousands of years. So, the next slide. If we look at the area of Moyle, the headland at the western side of the Hopkins River, there are a few features that I'll probably talk about as we work through the presentation. The headland car park, of course, and then offshore are 2 rock stacks, rock pillars, east stack on the eastern side and unimaginably west stack on the western side. These are features along with the headland itself, which are part of the story of Moyle, and along with the dunes inland that I showed you earlier. So it is a special place. People go there and park and look out at the ocean maybe, or go down onto the beach and look at what look like some dirty brown rocks, I guess, in cliff face. But through the work we've been doing, it's got a record of human visitation going back beyond 35,000 years. It's also got beautifully preserved an old beach. The 125,000-year-old beach is preserved at 8 or 9 places around the headland. And to me, it's always a thing that makes me imagine that you could have stood there 125,000 years ago and looked down over a beach that is much like the beach that's there now. In between that time, we've had low sea level, and we'll talk more about that shortly. The whole headland is built up of a whole series of dunes, going back maybe 500,000 years. And that story is there to see if you go down, and I hope some of you will, stand on the beach and just look at that dirty brown cliff, perhaps with your eyes and your understanding. Jim Bowler's found evidence of earthquake there, the slurry and disturbance of rocks that have been thrown around and washed about by earthquake disturbance, and then the eruption of Tower Hill volcano. And traditional owners lived through that time. You know, to me again, to think that they have been here at times of major earth events, you know, that would have been part of their culture and their history and their tradition, and maybe still are, John. It's so good to think about that. We look at Wanneroo today and think what a calm and peaceful, gentle place it is. It certainly has not always been that way. So, its recognition as a special place is now in law. It's been given an ongoing protection declaration, only the second one made in Victoria, so it's got the highest level of protection now. The other site's up at the Barn Forest on the Maar River, so a very high level of protection. And we've worked closely, as I said earlier on, with traditional owners, and John's Eastern Maar group are the registered party for this area. So anything that has to happen involving cultural heritage will happen through John and the Eastern Maar people. So let's go back to some of these events, and again, the eruption of Tower Hill was probably not a great event for the local people. Likened to like a nuclear explosion, you know, that you imagine what happens there. Molten rock comes up, it hits the groundwater table, water gets converted to steam under enormous pressure, and eventually that pressure is released in some massive explosion, and it created a crater 3.5 kilometres across, over 100 metres deep. It's now much filled, of course, but that event would have been catastrophic. And even here at Moyle, at the headland of the Hopkins River, there's a deposit of ash which is half a metre thick, and you can see it there in the bottom right-hand corner. It's a sign of a great tragedy, if you like, in the past, but it's a wonderful thing for a geologist because it's a geomarker, it's a time marker. Everything above that is younger than 35,000 years. Everything below it is older than 35,000 years. And so one of the very early clues we had to the significant age of some of the cultural material at Moyle was the presence of that geomarker from Tower Hill. So, the other thing of geological interest about Warrnambool is that it's built on a whole series of sand dunes. And Warrnambool is in fact an old bay that's been slightly filled up by sand. And you can see this as a digital elevation model, and you can see the parallel lines of the dunes there showing up quite clearly. The youngest of those, we call the Thunder Point Dune, it's 80,000 years old. And so as you march inland, you get to older and older dunes. And the town, the city of Warrnambool, the commercial centre, sits on about a 330 or 40,000 year old sand dune. And at Moyle, those sand dunes sit one on top of the other. And you can see them here, they're marked. They're actually delineated quite nicely by red soil lines. These are called terra rosa soils. They're red earths that don't form today. In fact, we all know from our gardening, we've got black soils. And so it was a different climate, you know, a hotter, drier climate. And in fact, it was so hot and dry, the natural cements called calcrates formed in the soils. And to find that's what farmers up around the Mallee called hard pan. You know, you need hot, dry climates to create those soils. And so we can see some climate information in there, and we've given them alphabetic numbering names. You can see going down through the cliff, Unit V, Unit T, Unit S, Unit R. And then there's a flat surface, ground surface alpha, then another unit, Unit Q, and then another flat surface on that, ground surface beta. So, you know, there's a whole history there. Each one of those soils and dune systems are separated by 100,000 years approximately. So if you start at the top and count down, you soon get to about 400,000 or 500,000 years of history there. We're really interested in the last 120,000 years, and this is a really important graph, okay? So there's one of these you've got to take away and remember. What you can see is depth on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, going back to 140,000 years. And the dark blue up to present sea level, you can see marked as 0, and then the red line is the history of sea level over the last 140,000 years. And the really significant thing is that there's only the present and one other time when the sea's been as high or higher than now in that whole period. For over 90-95% of that time, the sea's been lower than now. And that has great significance. We're talking about sea country. Much of the Aboriginal country, much of the traditional owner place, has sadly been buried by our most recent high sea level. I mean, you've got to imagine when the sea is lower, and what, 18,000 years ago, the sea was 140 metres lower than now. The coast was 50 to 80 kilometres south of here. Warrnambool was like Ballarat. And so people standing at Moyle for most of the last 140,000 years would have looked out over bushland. The coast was something way out there. And along with that was all of the culture, the heritage. And so sea country, and I'm not going to speak for John, he'll speak for himself I'm sure, but sea country is a very significant issue for traditional owners. A lot of their culture is out there, a lot of their stories and history is out there. So remember that graph, okay? The present high sea level, unusual time. Our seas are unusually full, right? And in fact, the coast hasn't, this is a pretty fluky thing to have a coast where it is today. I mean, the coast hasn't been here very much at all. And if you go back over the last 2 million years, the coast hasn't been here very much at all. We live in a very unusual geological time.
That old beach I talked about, the last time the sea was as high as now. Here's a spot I'm telling you to go and look at. It's a little geology excursion for you and the children. East Stack has a classic example of that last interglacial high sea level. That's that 120, 30,000 year high sea level. It's a notch carved in the old dune. This is the 500,000-year-old Unit V sand dune. So this is an old sand dune. If you look, you'll see old plant roots fossilised in the dune. But this notch is jam-packed with sand and boulders and rounded shells. And you can see a little close-up there on the right, looking into the notch. There are places like that all around the world. Please don't pick them up. Don't go souvenir hunting. But these are shells that where the beach was. And the reason that's preserved is the most wonderful feature again of our sand dunes. They're made of limestone. The whole of our beaches are actually biogenic sands. They're made up of the broken up shells of billions upon billions upon billions of shellfish. Sydney's got quartz sand beaches. Hawaii's got black sand volcanic beaches. We've got biogenic sands, limestone sands, and they self-cement. And so over geological time, that loose sand dune became a rock we call calcarenite, and the sand fill of that notch has become cemented only because they're limestone. And geologists and archaeologists from elsewhere in Australia don't fully appreciate the wonderful time capsule nature of some of the sites we've got down here. And one of the reasons our Moyle sites are so beautifully preserved is because of their geology. And it's an unusual geology that would not be found in places north of much of southern Australia. So, next slide. So let's start to talk about what Western science has to say about Aboriginal cultural sites at Moyle. And there are four I'm going to walk you through of increasingly older age. So the first one is familiar to anyone who knows Moyle, and it's a very large shell scatter down the slopes just to the west of the car park. And that material is eroding. It's eroding from a soil horizon up near the top where it's sort of spilt down as the soil's eroded over time. And you can see it's a very large shell scatter, very significant shell scatter from a radiocarbon date of 1,000 years ago. And we've got to roll those dates off. You know, and geologists and archaeologists are almost arrogant the way they talk about the recent. You know, I mean, the recent to a geologist is anything in the last 20 years. And to an archaeologist, the recent is anything in the last 1,000 years or so. You know, so this is one of the younger sites that we've dated at Moyle. And if you look at it in detail, there are a few important features. It's nearly all one species, and it's a species we call Turbo undulatus, or the wavy turbo. And it's a rocky shore shellfish. It was harvested by traditional owners for many thousands of years, as we'll see. And down here, this is a little collection that Ian put together one time, and it shows you four of the shells at the top, with below four fragments that were broken by skilled Aboriginal people with a stone tool. In order to access the animal inside the shell, which is like a snail shell, you just need a well-aimed blow with a stone just to break the bodywork, the last word at the bottom of the shell. And so this is one of the characteristic breakage patterns that we look for in human-made sites. You know, it shows the action of a skilled hand, if you like. Also on this slide is this little button shape here, little round operculum it's called. And this is the doorway that the wavy turbo uses to protect itself. So, you know, when it's out feeding on algae on a rocky platform and we walking around feeding, under threat, it retreats into its shell and shuts the door. And so to get the animal, you have to break in behind the door. And the doors turn out to be the most wonderful tools of science. And I'll show you some more about that in a minute. Firstly, they were wonderful things for radiocarbon dating. They're a lovely solid block of calcium carbonate. They've got carbon in them, so we can use it for radiocarbon dating. but they also are a wonderful indicator of size. You know, little shells have small doors, big shells have big doors, and that turned out to be one of the important bits of experiment that Ian and I did on the shells as part of our research. You can also see, I think the next slide maybe shows it better. Sure. Aboriginal people didn't just harvest the rocky shore, we know they harvested the estuary. And so you can see here I've arrowed in yellow shells of a species called Bellyhermangus australis, and it's a spiral-shaped gastropod, and it's now extinct in the Hopkins estuary. But 1,000 years ago, there were enough for Aboriginal people to harvest and use for food, and we think over time, conditions in the estuary have changed to become too fresh. As the mouth is slowly sanded up and the freshwater influence has increased in the estuary, the Bellyhermangus can no longer survive there. But I know from other shorebeds I've researched that they were common right up from 6,000 years ago up to about 1,000 years ago. But that was showing again something about Aboriginal people. They were harvesting the estuary, they were harvesting the ocean. The other thing you can see here, right down in the bottom right-hand corner, is one of those doorways, and it's blackened. It's been in a fire, and that's pretty unusual. A lot of the shell fragments we find are blackened. You know, there's no idea that this stuff had to be heated, you know, baked or whatever in a fire. Stuff ends up in a fire almost by accident. Most of the shells aren't blackened. And you can see here a plate of a chitin, like a little trial-blood animal. I'll show you a photograph of one later. There's some other limpets. So mostly it's turbo, but there are a few other species collected. So let's look at lower sea level, and this is an image from my colleague at Deakin, Daniel Dionacue. Daniel Irie, just called him for short. You can see Warrnambool clearly, but this is side-scan sonar imagery of the waters of Warrnambool. And if you stripped away the ocean, you can see the landscape. And what you can see is the extension of that dune system. Remember we spoke about the Thunder Point dune system, and here it extends out clearly under the bay. But I want to show you the thing that I'm interested in, is the old course of the Hopkins River. So you can see it. I'm going to stand up around it. It comes here, curves around, lovely little island, out, across. So at times of lower sea level, as we've said, Warrnambool's Ballarat, the Hopkins River is a freshwater stream. And it's flowing out across the coastal plain to a beach 50 to 80 kilometres away. And so that history is still preserved now, and so thanks to Daniel and his imagery, we can get this picture of the coast as it has been through time. So this is one of the sites that we have at Moyle from a time when the Hopkins River was a freshwater stream. And you can see here small shell fragments in a black soil, and these are thin-walled bivalve shells. There's not very many of them, and you can see they're all jumbled in tumbled array. When you look at this layer, and this is all cemented material, so it's very old. We think perhaps 20,000 years old. It could be older, we haven't really dated it. But it's a jumbled mess. It's one of these seismic slurries. There's been an earthquake, there's been a mud that's incorporated some shell material and some other broken bits of calcarenite and rhizomorphs, and they're in a whole mixture that's now become cemented. So this is, we think, is evidence of earthquake. Perhaps 20,000 years, although, as I say, we haven't dated it with any certainty. And that little bar, for example, at Courtesy, they are 1 centimetre squares, just to help you get your bearing. You can see that little scale inside, that each one of those black squares is a centimetre wide. Now this is another site. I'm particularly excited about this one. This is an even older site, because this lies underneath the Tower Hill ash, we believe. You know, when we look at the geological stratigraphy, it appears that Tower Hill ashes weathered away from this location and revealed about 4 fireplaces. This is just one of them here. You can see it perhaps about a half a metre across. You You can see the blackened stones, the discoloured stones. This is all really severely cemented, solidly cemented in place. The most amazing thing is the next slide. Because preserved, is part of the last meals of traditional owners. We found about 8 or 9 fragments of blackened shell on the mark on there. Again, thin-walled, freshwater or maybe estuarine shellfish that somehow or other were put in the fire, probably by accident, and the whole thing has become cemented, including these little fragments of shell. To me, it's the most amazing coincidence, most amazing fluke that stuff would be preserved from over 35,000 years ago. Really amazing. So already we've gone back in time from 1,000 years to 35,000 years with a continuous occupation almost of traditional owners of that headland. And what I always think about with the headland is at times of low sea level, it was the first high point as you came in there in the landscape. So it was a jump, if you like. And so it would have always been a place that stood out in the landscape, and it was next to a freshwater river. And it's not a bad place to camp, but it's the sort of thing that you would imagine people would be gravitating towards. It just cries out and it's what to do. So then we go back to the time, and now we're getting into some stuff that is really perhaps a bit controversial, but it's extremely exciting. We go back to the last time that the sea was as high as now. 120,000 years ago. And Edmund Gill was drawn here, a guy, Jim Henry, the local naturalist, brought this site to Edmund Gill's attention, and we started looking at it in 1983. And it's so many years on, we're still looking at it, but nonetheless, Edmund recognised the significance that here we have all these sharp-edged broken shells cemented firmly in place. And they're mostly turbo. Now think back to what I showed you with the 1,000-year-old site. Here you have the same thing, only it's so old it's cemented in place and it's below the Tower Hill ash, so it's at least 35,000 years old. So we knew this was a significant site worthy of further research. And it's not just the shells like that. Here you can see an abalone shell and another turbo shell. This is the body of the turbo shell in the sands. Next one. Crab claws. We found about half a dozen fragments of the reef crab, Ozias truncatus, and this one of my honour students from a few years back, a guy Hannah Maar, produced this. These are electron micrograph images of the next couple. So that's the crab claw. This is one otolith we found. This is a ear bone of a fish, a mulloway. And it wasn't a little fish. This is a 3.5 to 5.5 kilogram mulloway when we compare the size of the otolith with the ones we find in modern day fish. So a big estuarine fish. And these are these plates again of the chitin, the trilobite type animal that we found weathering out of the site. These are all species you would expect to find in a human site. And so, we started to develop at the time, the scary hypothesis that maybe this was a human site and that people were here 120,000 years ago. Adding to that, you've got charcoal in the sand. It's quite obvious here, lenses of charcoal, and and what look like burned stones. Here you can see a stone. These are all cemented in place, and the pieces are in what we call jigsaw fit. It's been heat fractured, and the bits are sort of sitting where they fractured apart. And then over on the right is a specimen that's on display in the new room. We'll probably look at it later. But it's a rock balanced on another one. It's a pretty unusual geological event. And the top one you can clearly see it's been black. And another one. And in places we get these scatters of blackened stones and shells. And again, you can see that like fire blackening on the tips of the stone there that suggest fire very strongly to me. So, this site, what is it? Well, if you just had to summarise it, it's basically one species. The shells we find are not only, but they're overwhelmingly turbo. There's a limited range of sizes, and I'll show you more on that shortly. If it was a natural deposit on our high-energy ocean coast, the fragments should be rounded. You know, things get rolled and tumbled in the surf, and so they would be rounded, but they're not. They're sharp-edged. They occur in the soil. They occur with charcoal. They occur with terrestrial snails. There's about 5 species of snails that we've identified on the site, terrestrial snails. And they live in a heathland environment. So, you know, the coast there looked like it does today, with just a low heathland on it. It wasn't a forest. And it's above sea level, about 8 metres above present sea level, in places up to 10 metres above present sea level. So in our mind, it was a myth. But, oh sorry, no, my butt was a bit premature. There's a but to come, okay. Okay, a human site, 120,000 years. This is a map, and I don't think it's changed that much, Ian, has it? But these are sites known in Australia over 30,000 years. Okay? So there's about a dozen of them. If you say how many are over 50,000 years, there's 2 or 3. We're now claiming evidence for a human site that's 120,000 years. So it almost doubles the accepted time of occupation of Australia by traditional owners. So it's a site of great significance for Australian archaeology. It's a problem that has to be solved, if you like. But it's also significant on a global sense, because if we accept that people evolved in Africa, us Homo sapiens, and the migration time out of Africa is thought to be sometime around 180 to 120,000 years. And so this site starts to bump closely up against times of people moving out of Africa. And not just moving out of Africa, moving to about as far away from Africa as you could possibly get. And making a sea voyage at some point to get there, because you had to get from Southeast Asia to what's called Sahul, which is this landmass of New Guinea in Australia, and then walk down here to the bottom end. So a pretty significant site, and well worth solving. So here's my but. With science, you look at the evidence objectively, and you don't just go down the one path, right? You think, well, what else could do this? And with Steve Carey, I've been involved in a project looking at fossil footprints in the sand dunes. These are a whole lot of animals that walked over the sand dunes and left their footprints, which are now preserved. And so Steve and I and another colleague, Aaron Caymans at Adelaide University, have been looking at documenting these footprints where we find them in the sand dunes across southern Australia, all the way across to Perth. And wandering around the Eyre Peninsula, I came across seabirds collecting shellfish and watched a Pacific gull, the guy here on the left, paddle out into the low tide rocky shore, find a turbo shell, fly up high, about 5 to 10 metres, and drop it onto a rock to break it. And then the animal will fly down, pick out the broken shell. I watched that happen 3 or 4 times at this spot. And it was one of those eureka moments that they call. And I thought, wow. So then I went looking at the deposits of the seabird middens. And this is what's called, this is one of these angle rocks where the Pacific gull's been dropping its shells completely. And this is when you get a bit of a chill, because you look at it and it's nicely turbo. And the sharp-edged fragments. And this is when you think, boy, we've got to have a think about this, is it possible that we have a seabird midden at Moyle. So Ian and I started exploring that, and the next sort of graph. This is where those little button Operculum came into play. We measured the diameters of them, and across the bottom is 0 to 3 millimetres. That's a tiny, tiny one. Up to about as big as they get, 24.1 to 27 millimetres, an inch in the old scale, if you like. And this here is cumulative frequency. It's a frequency distribution curve. And the blue graph is for Moyle. The red one is for one of these spots in the Eyre Peninsula, Point of Void, and so is the green one from a spot called Golden Island, where I found Pacific gold mittens and collected the Operculum and measured their diameters. And you've got to admit two things. Seagulls are pretty selective about size for a start. They are not interested in a meal until you get to about a 9 millimetre diameter Operculum. They just ignore the little shellfish, so they feed on big ones. They're highly selective. And in fact, our Moyle site overlaps that pretty closely, you'd have to say, but with one distinction which I think could be important. The Moyle site's got a small percentage of small shells. Now, let's go to the next slide. These are some Aboriginal mittens, and the diameters of the Operculum from two Aboriginal sites. One at Cape Deakin, which is some work that Ian's group had done, and I spent a day up at Monash University measuring diameters of Operculum and they collected there. And some from that 1,000-year-old site at Moyle, Point Richie, up on the slope there. And you can see again, humans are pretty selective. They don't waste their time with little things, but there are some small shells found. And people who observe traditional owners collecting, it's mostly done by the women, and the kids go. And the kids copy them. And so back in the camp, you find in the middens some small, tiny Operculum, probably collected by a family group. They're probably too small to be a reasonable meal, but collected perhaps. Maybe sometimes take that accidentally if you're sweet, I don't know. A small percentage of small Operculum. So where does that leave us if we go to? There's no doubt that in Moyle we've got size selection. Absolutely no doubt. Something picked out the big things, mostly. The species collected and their size, unfortunately humans and Pacific gulls overlap heavily. And I've often wondered, did people watch gulls doing what they did in order to work out what you may or may not be able to eat? I don't know. But it just seems that the same species and the same size range is collected. It might be that you can't tell apart a seabird midden and a human midden just based on the shells alone. It's possible the small shells are diagnostic, but that look, well, it's not quite a dead end, but it's not, no one's going to lay down and say, well, yeah, we proved it based on just the shell evidence. But remember there's evidence of fire. Seabirds definitely don't like fires. And so we've really, the other thread of the research has been to look at the evidence of fire at the site. And so blackening of stones is not conclusive of fire on its own because different chemicals can stain rocks black. But what we use is a test called TL, thermoluminescence. And thermoluminescence uses small amounts of quartz grains that occur in sand and stones and pottery. And when you heat quartz grains to a very high temperature, you reset a little clock inside them. And then over time, that clock slowly starts ticking again, and you can determine the time since it was last heated, if you like, when you measure it today. And so what we did was take some of those blackened stones, 3 of them, and at the University of Wollongong, they did a thermoluminescence dating on the blackened stones. And you can see here the 3 ages of the stones are all around 120,000 years. There's a bit of a scatter there, but that's a really significant finding. the black stones were heated at the same time as the shells were collected and the sand was being deposited. So the heating of those blackened stones is contemporaneous with the shells. I mean, we needed to establish that because it could have been a group of blokes going down at the end of the football club season barbecue at the mouth of the river in the 1940s. You know, I mean, we had to establish that the blackening of the stones was the same time as the shells, which we have established, and so a very significant part of our research findings. Ian has got the patience of a saint and has painstakingly excavated a possible fireplace feature at the site. And when I say painstaking, you watch these people over 2 weeks, scraping a centimetre at a time off, photographing and collecting material that they get, mapping everything in 3 dimensions as they do it. It's a highly, you've got to be incredibly patient there. And I would have been there with a shovel and a bucket, and that's why I'm an archaeologist. But this excavation by Ian is only part of it, and you can see here some charcoal being revealed in the pit, if you like, as it excavates down, and the yellow arrow marks a blackened stone that has been uncovered, and then where the yellow ropes cross is a red stone, one of these very old soils, terra rosa, and it's got a tiny bit cracked off the end, cracked off the end. Ian's done a very clinical analysis of the evidence for this being a fireplace versus whether it could be lightning strike, whether it could be wildfire. And unfortunately, the evidence is even-handed. You know, yes, there's some evidence supporting it being a fireplace, there's some evidence supporting it being a wildfire, there's no evidence supporting it being a lightning strike. But the evidence is still equivocal. And so what we need to do, though, is not consider each line of evidence on its own, but you've got to consider them together. If this was a wildfire, it would be unusual on that heathland that we know the snails tell us was there, for it to generate enough heat to blacken stones all the way through. To do that, we know you need hundreds of 400 or 500 degrees, maybe for half an hour to 3/4 of an hour. Certainly temperatures that you wouldn't get in the heathland of wildfire. And so, you know, the evidence for wildfire is not great. So if we go to the next slide, we have to accept that neither line of evidence on its own is conclusive. Jim Mole, one of our team, he thinks you take the 2 lines of evidence together and he is convinced it's a human song. The rest of us perhaps get a little bit more cautious. I think the case is compelling, but I accept the argument from archaeologists that this site is so significant, it really demands a very high level of proof. You know, they are saying, if you are going to say something about your arrival time, if you're going to double the time of people being known to be in Australia, if you're going to bring forward pictures about the movement of people that are modern in South Africa, this is the bar is very high for us, so we accept that. And so we recognise the need for further research. And so one of the things we did in 2018, we published 6 research papers on the site. The Royal Society of Victoria very generously gave us space to produce a very, very detailed description of the site and the arguments around its origin. And that allowed us to put out very clearly the state of the evidence. We hope that would attract interest from overseas people or scientists with new techniques that would perhaps answer that question to the level of proof that the archaeological community would like. So, and we got lucky. We attracted the attention of Dr. Paul Goldberg from Boston University, who's a world authority on human fireplaces. He's worked on them in South Africa, he's worked on them in Japan, he's worked on them in America. So, if we go to the next one. This is this is a quote from one of his research papers, just so you can see something of the man. And he is able to look at thin sections of samples under the microscope and read stories of what might have happened to human activity at the site. And so really specialised research. But Ian has made a comment that if Paul Goldberg says this is a human fireplace, no one in the world is going to disagree. So a pretty high-level person to have on board to see whether there is evidence that he can provide. So, we go on to the next slide. And here he is, at Moyle, working to collect an undisturbed core from Ian's fireplace. Well, it's not Ian's fireplace, the fireplace that Ian worked on. Ian re-excavated, reopened the site, the core was taken, along with the core from the second fireplace. And they were wrapped up in plaster of Paris. You can see Paul's there applying some plaster of Paris in preparation to get out that core. And of course, then COVID hit. And the samples are locked at Monash University, and they had were locked for a year, all of last year. You know, we were waiting to get these samples before Goldberg. And it's only now that it looks like we will be able to get them up to the University of Wollongong, where they've got to be impregnated with resin. Once they're impregnated with resin, they're then solid, able to be transported, and we'll get them off to America and hopefully solve, or see whether Paul can help solve the problem. Maybe he can't, but at least we've got a very good person looking at it this now. So I think I'm getting near my end of my talk. So what can we say? Well, it is a special place. There's a history of occupation, at least 5,000 years old. There's a geological story there, which is amazing. You know, we've got stories of high sea level going back 500,000 years or more, and we've got evidence of earthquake, evidence of volcanic eruption, and we perhaps have Australia's oldest human site, perhaps. So all I can urge you to do is watch this space. And last slide, Sherry. So if you would like to find the journal articles, they're there. The Royal Society of Victoria, 2018, volume 130. If you're very patient, you can read all 6. If you want the quick version, you can read the first paper, which gives a bit of a summary and an overview. But I should also acknowledge Edmund Gill. Edmund Gill passed away in 1986. He and I worked together from about 1981. And yeah, it was just a tragedy that he passed away, I guess, before we really got into the guts of trying to solve the modern story. But anyway, thank you all very much, and I think it's time for John to have the last word.
Thanks for that. That's it's always good to sit next to John, and not only listening to all the information that's been gathered over many years, but to hear the passion as well, and that's pretty amazing. So thanks. So just to give a cultural view on this, my grandfather, long gone now, his grandparents were alive in Europeans first came here. So in the 1830s, and so very recent, not many generations ago. And the very first thing, he told the story that the very first thing our people endeavoured to do was indoctrinate these new people into Aboriginal law, into Maar law or Mara law. And the purpose of doing so was to say, well, you know what, if you guys are going to stay here, you need to know where you are. You need to know where you are, and you need to know what your role is here. Because you've got obligations. You've got obligations. You're going to live here, you've got obligations to look after this place. And so we're collectively known as the Maar or Maar, some would say. We're not traditional owners, we're not Aboriginal people, we're Maar. We're Maar. And often you'll hear the word Gulich Maar, and Gulich literally means belonging to. I am belonging to the Maar. And Europeans obviously had a different agenda. They had a different view, a different lens on how land was to be accessed, how it was to be used. And for us, all of our knowledge holders, we think about the society today. We've got doctors, we've got teachers, we've got a functioning society. The Maar also had functioning societies. We had knowledge holders, we had healers, we had lawmen and women. We had a whole array of dynamic landscape that we adapted to, that we looked after, and every piece of our country, be it sea country or terrestrial, everything had a purpose and a plan. There was a plan for everything. So, often you'll see we're in this amazing environment down here, wanting to now the southwestern Victoria. You can go out to Tower Hill, otherwise known to us as Troich. You go out there, you stand at the top and you see all the other volcanic craters that pepper our landscape, and every one of them has a story associated with it. And it was that lens that we view our world through, and also ties us to our obligations to the country. And we'd never seen the country. When Europeans came here, we'd never seen it, and nor did we see our obligations to look after it. And that's certainly part of our role as what we do, with particularly in the southwest now, with village Meer, with Eastern Maar, and as the Maar representative bodies, we have obligations to look after the country. And so the work that's occurring here, for us, it's a bit, I don't know, fringe to us, in the sense that we don't, the relativity of time for us is totally irrelevant in a Western concept. It's very linear, and we can see, possibility that it was 120,000 years ago. But my grandfather always said, for us, our time was circular. It never mattered at all when something happened. What mattered was that it did happen, and that the story was retained. So, Moyle, for us, if there's bad news that comes back and says it's not 120,000 years old, it's like, that's fine for us. If it comes back and says it's 120,000 years old, that's fine. And it's fine because we've always said, if you ask any Aboriginal person, they'll say, if you ask them, how long have you been here? They're going to say, we've been here forever. We've been here forever. And how long is forever? It's forever as long as people have been here. And with that in mind, the work, we view the work, somewhat with a sense of fascination, because we enjoy, we go back to our kitchen tables and we say, you shouldn't see many white colours in there. They're crazy over the shelves, eh? But we love that passion as well, because our story is the story of who you are. Our story here, and Royal particularly, is your story as much as it is ours. It's a human story. And sharing this story today is an example of us continuing to want to share our knowledge about country. And we're growing and learning as well. But that goes back to the times when Europeans were first coming into our territory, and our people saying, you know what, you want to stay here, you're really going to know where you are and what you're doing here and what your obligations are. And so, again, this today is part of that story. People say back in the dream time, the dream time's now. The fact that you're here today and part of this conversation, part of this story, this is now part of your story. And that's the concept of what the dream is forever created. And we can look at those charts, when the sea levels were and how erratic they were over a period of time. And that's going to continue. you know, and we know that. We live in one of the most dynamic coastlines in Australia, what is now known as Australia, and we'll adapt. We always do, as people, we do. And if anything, that's a lesson that we in Maar can offer the broader community is around adaptation and honouring who you are, and honouring where you are. So Moyle in particular, it is a significant place for us. The whole of our country, all of our country is significant. When we say Mary is our word for country. And our relationship with it is one of family. And each and every one of you can relate to this. If you think for a moment about your relationships, think about your relationships with the people in your family, your kids, your grandkids. Think about the relationship that you have with your parents, with your own siblings. And you think about all the stress that relationship can bring you. You think about the joy it can bring you. You think about all those emotions. That's our relationship with country. It's never transactional. It is family. And it's an obligation to look after that place. It's to look after your family. And that's the very basis of what we're doing. So in many ways, when we think about Royal in isolation of all that and the work that is occurring there, it is in many ways for us a bit of a caring factor to look after country. Let's see what country can teach us, because right now, country, our family member, is our teacher. And we're going to learn a lot from this place as a person. We're going to learn a lot, we're going to grow a lot as a result. And so that's why we as Maar and Mara have been really strong in encouraging these sort of works to occur, and we hope that they will continue going forward. And speaking about those relationships with us as tradition owners in academia, back in the 60s, we had what was anthropologists and archaeologists, it's a dirty word, and but they used to come in and they would effectively raid our communities. They would raid us of our knowledge, they would raid our resources. They'd come in and they would pilfer everything that was valuable to us. And if cultural heritage is a human right, they were really having that impact on us as people. And and people without a story, without a history, without knowing where you come from, who you are, you start deployed. There's no real direction in what you're doing or where you're going as a society. So the relationship here really is reflective of how far that has now come, where there is mutual respect, where knowledge within our community is being honoured, and the way we capture knowledge and the way we share that knowledge is also being acknowledged. And so whilst I'm not able to come up here and stand, give all those measured accounts, that is in parallel now, equally, with our stories of our creation. We can speak about Clarke, Tower Hill, and the time it erupted. The word Clarke literally means lava. So our people were here, we witnessed those, and we have those accounts. Village Bend is another great example of an ongoing story around that time. And so the adaptation that comes from that as well, an atomic bomb going off, it would have been, there would have been a time when our people would not have been able to access that country for a long period of time. We had environmental refugees, people that moved through. But in that, we adapted as well. We lived in villages, we weren't these nomadic blackfellas that you may have read about. We had strong cultures, strong economies. We were very well established, and we were able to, utilise the resources available to us, possibly for 120,000 years, and adaptation of that. So in all, it's, from a traditional owner's perspective around the work that's happening, we're really pleased with how it's going. We're not so much hinged on the result, I don't think, as some may be in academia land, but we are hinged on the relationship, and that's something that our kids will now inherit. Thank you.
Insightful, and I sort of half want to become a scientist and a geologist and archaeologist and all that sort of stuff because it's fascinating. But it truly does prove the point that Moyle is an extremely special place and unique because of the limestone that's captured everything. Second thing.